Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. The war in Vietnam was one of the greatest disasters in American history. Today we shall discuss a book that describes how and why the United States got into and stayed in that war. The book is A Grand Delusion. Its author, here with me to discuss his book, is Robert Mann, and I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Bob, let me thank you for coming all the way from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. We've had people from California, so you're not the first person to come a long way, but it is a long way.
Thank you, Larry.
Bob, in the very last paragraph of your book, the whole last paragraph says the following: whatever good may have come from the war, and no matter how honorable and brave the soldiers on both sides, the Vietnam War should be remembered as the kind of tragedy that can result when presidents, captivated by grand delusions, enforce their foreign and military policies without the informed support of Congress and the American people. Are you worried that this kind of informed consent that you speak and write about has not been given in the days since Vietnam? And are you worried that this may be happening again? And I should say to the audience, before you answer that question, we tape these shows in advance. Today, we happen to be taping this show at 10:30 in the morning of Monday, August 26th, the very day that a huge article appeared in the Wall Street Journal, which said that Bush's people have said to the public that they can go to war in Iraq, they don't need congressional help, they do not need a congressional resolution. They can rely on the resolution that was passed 11 years ago when we first went to war with Iraq. They can rely on the resolution that was passed due to the al-Qaeda attack on September 11th. And so never before, I have to say, have I ever done a television show that seemed to be as current as that morning's headlines, literally. Mm-hmm. But this is what we face as of today. So with that, let me ask you to, if you want to address that question, which I mentioned to you.
Well, thank you, Larry. I think that you're absolutely right. It is a very relevant question for today. The Vietnam War, I think, was largely a tragedy because one man or one small group of men took us into that war without the informed consent of the American people and their representatives in Congress. It was for no insignificant reason that the founders of this nation vested the power to go to war with the representatives of the people, the elected representatives who are closest to the people. The Congress are given that power, and the president given the responsibility to fight the war as commander-in-chief. And starting in the 1950s with Korea and subsequently almost every conflict that we've been involved in this country has been fought without the informed consent of the American people and their representatives. Even the Gulf War in 1991 was really fought without the consent of Congress because Bush made it clear that was an irrelevancy, that he would go to war whether or not Congress approved it. So I think it's very relevant that now we're facing the same situation possibly where the president has said that he regards congressional approval as something irrelevant or superfluous, and that the decision is his and his alone to make. I think it's not only unconstitutional to make that argument, but I think that it is potentially politically disastrous and sets us up for failure if we get into this war without the support of the American people and their representatives.
Just to be absolutely crystal clear on what you're saying, even though a resolution was passed after being much bruiting about whether or not a resolution ought to be put before the Congress in 1991, even though a war resolution was passed, your view is this really wasn't the free will and consent of Congress because it was faced with an alternative in which the first George Bush said, I am going to fight this war and you can get on board or not get on board as you choose. I hope you get on board. It will be better politically. It will give me support. It will show the world that we are united. Right. Which it did, even though it passed by only about a 60% vote in each house. It was not a unanimous thing. Right. But your point of view, Congress was faced with what was about to become, and it knew was about to become, a fait accompli.
Right. Right. Congress had a gun to its head, and many members had the courage to vote the other way. I'm not here to say whether those were wise decisions or not, but my point is that it strikes me as absurd for the son of the president who said that I will go to war in Iraq, regardless of what Congress says, for his son to now use that resolution that his own father said was irrelevant
Yeah.
as justification for going into Iraq is an absurdity.
Let me make another point to the audience, which I think they ought to know. I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that neither you nor I hold a firm opinion one way or the other, maybe not even an infirm opinion one way or the other, whether we ought to fight a war in Iraq.
Right.
So we are discussing something entirely different here. You were
right.
simply saying Congress ought to make the decision, not which way the decision ought to be made.
Yeah, I'm saying that this is not a decision that the president constitutionally gets to make, although he and other presidents, and let me make it clear that this is not a position that only the current President Bush has taken. President Clinton, President Bush's father, and on and on and on, presidents have maintained that they and they alone have the power to do this as commander-in-chief. But I'm here to say that this is a decision that Congress should make. No matter where they go, Congress should make that decision.
For all the worship is too strong a word. For all the good feelings about Harry Truman, it is true, isn't it, that Harry Truman and Dean Acheson changed the shape of the Constitution of this country in 1950 in what is perhaps the most fundamental aspect of the country's life, war. When they decided they were going to fight in Korea, they didn't care what Congress thought, and they never took it to Congress. That was the first time we ever had a really major war. There'd been a lot of Barbary pirate type of things in the southern, in Latin America. And Reagan had the great good sense to pick on weaklings who couldn't fight back very effectively. But Truman was the first time, and then Johnson, we ever really got into a war of significant consequence on the president's own hook. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, does that have any bearing? You wrote a lot about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Does that have any bearing on what's going on today, in your opinion?
Well, I think it does. And let me go back to Korea, because I think Korea begat Tonkin, and that is that Truman went to war without the consent or even consultation of Congress, and paid an awful political price for it. There were other factors that maybe we can get into later, but Truman paid an awful, and his party paid an awful political price because they did not consult Congress. So therefore, Republican members of Congress and some Democrats, because they weren't in on the decision, were free to attack Truman over his war policies in Korea. Lyndon Johnson and his aides learned from that experience. Johnson, of course, was around at that time and watched and learned from Truman's experience. And his point of view was that I'm not going to get into the war without Congress being in on the take. If they're going to be in it, I want to be in on the takeoff and the landing and the crash landing.
Yeah.
And so, but what happened is Johnson only carried through on half of that. He got their approval, but it wasn't informed. He tricked them. He lied to them. He manufactured, or he and his men manufactured a crisis and used that to rush through a use of force resolution that gave Johnson carte blanche. It was a predated declaration of war that Johnson and subsequent presidents used to fight that war in Vietnam. It was consent, but it wasn't informed consent, and that's the key.
And Fulbright and others later said, look, if we had realized that this was being used to authorize a huge war in Asia, we would never have approved that. And as you said, I mean, we don't have time to get into all the lies that went into persuading Fulbright and the House to run that resolution through in 2 days.
Right.
2 days. That was it. And the resolution is relevant too, isn't it, Bob? In that the wording was so broad.
Right.
Congress recently has undertaken in '91, in '98. Again after September 11th, Congress is passing these broad-scale resolutions that say to the president, isn't it, you fight a war anywhere you want, anytime you want.
Right. And what is so tragic about that is that Congress will spend more time debating a prescription drug benefit or a patient's Bill of Rights, which are all important pieces of legislation and deserve an adequate, exhaustive hearing, but they will spend more time debating a piece of legislation like that than they will debating whether we go into war. And when we do go to war, I'm disturbed by the fact that we're using these use of force resolutions where when you read the wording of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the use of force resolution that was adopted last year by Congress after the attacks of September 11th, they really don't give the president authority to do anything. They ratify the authority that Congress says he already has, which is a fundamental difference, and I think it's a further abdication of the responsibility of Congress. They're pretending to exercise the responsibility, but they're really not, because they're basically just rubber stamping and saying you already have the responsibility, the authority to do what we're pretending
Yeah.
to give you the authority to do.
Today in the paper, again, this is as recent as this morning's headlines, people are taking the position that as commander-in-chief, the president has the power to fight a war anywhere he wants, anytime he wants, as big as he wants, against whomever he wants. Now, that same thing, that same power was used in Vietnam. Where did, or that same claim, I should say, where did Congress, on the other hand, get the idea, back at the beginning of the Cold War and in Vietnam, that it's got no power in foreign relations, that whatever the president says goes, and their job is simply to sit and listen and a rubber stamp? Who got that idea and why?
Well, I think there's a number of factors, and you've identified some of them in some of your writings, and that, I think part of it is that Congress was disastrously involved in foreign affairs in the early part of the century. That the Senate particularly made some very bad decisions that led to a greater war and greater loss of life, and rejecting the League of Nations, for example.
Yeah, yeah.
But what I think, what really happened that turned the tide was the nuclear age. And suddenly the notion arose in Congress and in the country that because of the nuclear age and because the decisions that would be made about war and peace were split-second decisions, we somehow had the view, or the view took hold, that we don't have the luxury of debate when it comes to war, that there's a hand on the button about ready to fire nuclear weapons at us, and we don't have the luxury of debating. The problem is we really, except in maybe one instance that I can think of in Cuba, we've never been faced with war in that, particular situation.
Right.
We always have had the luxury
Right.
of a debate. We've just never taken the time to do it.
Right.
And the argument to me is fallacious to say that in the nuclear age we don't have time to make these decisions in a reasoned, deliberative way.
You know, before we get back to Vietnam and today, it's not a widely known fact that, of course, it is widely known that there was debate within the administration, Kennedy and his executive comm, for 10 or 11 days. But what is not widely known is that not only did the Russians have nuclear weapons in Cuba, they had tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba, and Khrushchev, as he was required to do under the Russian system, had signed off giving commanders the power to use those tactical nuclear weapons, so that if our army came across the shore of Cuba, they would have been fired, and clearly that would have been World War III. Right. And as I say, we did have the luxury of some debate because the ex-com debated for 10 or 11 days as to what to do.
And you're right about that. Even there, we had time to deliberate.
Now, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was used by Johnson to author as alleged authority for everything he did, to the horror of the people who sponsored it, who said it was never intended to do that. Do you think there's a legitimate argument to be made, and the administration is making it here, it's in the newspapers today, that a resolution that was passed 11 years ago in 1991 is authority for war today? You've worked with the Congress in one guise or another for a long time. What do you think about an argument like that?
Well, I'm no constitutional scholar. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not really the best person to comment on the legal ramifications of that, although it strikes me as a pretty thin reed to build a war policy, a war on. Politically, I do think that is a disastrous, potentially disastrous way to build a war consensus, to say that I can go back and use a resolution passed 11 years ago to take the country into war. And I think that if we've learned anything from Vietnam, that we should have learned that you don't take the country into war without the informed. I keep beating this drum.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
It sounds like it's my mantra, but it's true. We can't take the country into war without the informed consent of the American people and their representatives. And presidents who have done this without informing the people and getting the approval of Congress have met with disaster. Truman and Johnson are two great examples of
It
this.
finished off Truman.
It did.
It finished off Johnson. And realistically speaking, it finished off Nixon, because what he did led directly to Watergate.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. What do you think the reaction would have been if you went, and I mean this may happen, if you went to the people who passed that resolution in 1991 and asked them, many of them are still in Congress today, did you intend by this to authorize a war 11 years later?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it just almost answers itself. They look at you like, you got to be crazy. You draw a distinction between, and you did just a minute ago too, and you've done it in personal conversation, between the constitutional side of it and the political side of it. But the two things get wrapped up together, don't they, quite often in people's minds?
Well, they do, and unfortunately, people. You and I were talking before the show began about the sort of the exasperation that I think some people feel when we have these constitutional discussions. I mean, I think it's understandable, and it gives the president, I think, a powerful argument to make that basically, and what he's saying now, or at least what his surrogates are saying now, is that Saddam Hussein has a gun to our head, and we have to do something about it. That there's this clear and present danger here. The problem is that until they really make that case, which I don't think they have, we don't have the information that I think we need to make these decisions. So people get very exasperated when they hear that, oh, Saddam Hussein has biological weapons of mass destruction. He's about ready to attack the United States. We're already living in daily fear of another terrorist attack. And then they hear people like you and me talking about the Constitution and what the Constitution says we should do about this. If the president can make the argument that attack is imminent, then I think the rules of the game change.
Sure.
But he hasn't made that argument, and I don't think it seems to me they haven't even tried very hard to come up with the evidence.
It's always seemed to me, Bob, that another way in which the two things coalesce is that we're Congress to think, as a thought for the first 150 years of the country's life, that it has the duty, the responsibility of making the decision on war, then politically it is more likely to make that decision, to actually take its responsibility seriously. When the idea took hold that constitutionally it's all for the president to decide, well then, as in Vietnam, right, it just became easy for the legislators, hey, that's George's department, let
right.
George do it, let Lyndon do it, you know,
right.
let Tricky Dick do it. Right. Now let the second George Bush do it and so forth. So there's a certain coalescence that comes from your legal view.
Well, that's right. And here's the thing, and in my book, I think people have been surprised how tough I am on the critics of the war. Because there were people,
You mean the critics in Congress?
Critics in Congress of the war. People like William Fulbright, George McGovern, Frank Church, Mike Mansfield, on and on and on. All these people who we now hold out as great champions of right during this time, very prescient people who understood the risks and spoke out early. With the exception of Wayne Morse, senator from Oregon, and Ernest Greening, senator from Alaska, every one of them voted for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Every one of them supported President Kennedy as he got the nation deeper into war. Every one of them supported President Johnson in the earlier days. Every one of them, and I use this word not cavalierly, every one of them, with the exception of two men that I can think of, were complicit in the policies that led to the morass that this country found itself in Vietnam. And so, I think that we need more vigilance. We needed more vigilance at that time. We didn't get it. All these people who rightly spoke out against the war, it was good that they did it, but they did it too late. And what I'm afraid of today is that by the time we're in this thing, I just hope that we don't find out that we're in it too late. It doesn't do a lot of good to use a barnyard analogy to close the barn door after the horse is out. You can't get it once men are in the field, once troops are in the field, and this was the powerful argument against pulling our men back. Because once the flag is planted, once the troops are in the field, it is very, very hard politically and constitutionally for a Congress to force an end to a war. It's almost impossible.
Well, you are just as tough on the critics in Congress as you're saying here. You really, it's quite dramatic. And you make the point all the time, repeatedly. Mansfield must have written 50 or 100 private memos to Johnson.
Yes, he did.
They would have private talks all the time with Johnson, both Richard Russell and Mansfield. And they would urge him not to fight this war and warn him about the disaster that he was facing. They would say nothing in public.
Yeah.
Nothing in public. Now, that's changing a little bit today, isn't it? I mean, right now, Biden and Daschle and others are saying we're going to have a debate in Congress, we're going to have hearings in Congress. They're writing political scientists and lawyers, give us your opinions. this looks to be changing as we sit here today talking about this, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And again, let me say that I think that's a good thing. I'm not here to say we shouldn't go into Iraq. I'm here to say we should have a debate about it. And I think that is a very encouraging thing that Joe Biden and others on the Foreign Relations Committee have had these hearings, because I think that it has brought the issue to the forefront. It has caused there to be a vigorous debate. Maybe not on the floor of the Senate and the House, but at least in the newspapers and throughout official Washington and throughout the country. That was not something you really had during Vietnam. We went in there with our eyes closed, and even members of the Foreign Relations Committee many times weren't informed about what we were doing. So I think that's a good thing. Whether we go into Iraq or not, I'm not here to prejudge that. I'm just happy that we are starting to have something of a debate, and I think that the credit should be given to those in Congress who have started it. The problem is that there's always people on the other side who say that kind of debate is destructive, that it gives aid and comfort to the enemy. And we've already heard some of that earlier this year when Tom Daschle and others made some very, very, very mild critiques of the war effort in Afghanistan, and they were attacked as if they had committed treason. And so that I think is the next thing that's going to happen.
You know, just before we get into the break, this kind of attack on people who have a different view, this was rife in Vietnam, right? And it's going on again, and it'll continue to go on apparently. And I have to say that you have to give these folks in Congress and others some credit for it went on after 9/11 when some people stood up and said, hey, maybe, you know, maybe there's some other things to think about here. You got to give some credit to the people in Congress who stood up, but they're a little late, aren't they? I mean, not that they're not going to be doing it. Shouldn't this have started a few months ago?
Well, it probably should have, and what I'm afraid of is that so much of this is going to may prove to be irrelevant if the president thinks and is not persuaded, or his hand is not forced by Congress into realizing that he doesn't have the authority to do what he thinks he can do. He keeps saying, I'm a patient man, as if it's his decision and his alone, and the Congress needs to do more than just hold hearings. They need to have a debate and vote on whether we go to war or not, because that's their role. And until they've done that, I think they're doing better, but they're still shirking their responsibility.
We have to take a break for a public service announcement. We'll be right back. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back. Bob, when we got in Vietnam, we knew nothing, as it turned out, about the country, about the people, about the culture, about Ho Chi Minh, about the fellow who was on our side, Diem, the fellow whom we put into power, about what the people want, about what the peasantry, the people in the country wanted. We just went into Vietnam because they had this domino theory in mind, and they sold the Senate and the House a bill of goods saying that we must fight now, we must fight big time, or pretty soon, as Johnson said, we're going to be fighting them in the streets of San Francisco, which was utter baloney, and so forth. Well, here's my question. What is it that we don't know or that we need to find out today about Iraq, fundamentalism, what's going on in Afghanistan? In other words, what is it that we need to know or to learn in order to make, in your judgment, a well-considered decision on whether we ought to fight a war in Iraq?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and I think it's one that's really not being, you're the first person I've heard ask that question, and I think it's one that ought to be debated, because to me one of the fundamental questions about our involvement in Vietnam was, is it a military solution or a political solution? And you know, it's the old saying, when all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Right.
Well,
right.
You know, we've always got that hammer in our hand, and we want to keep pounding those nails. And we haven't asked, are there other ways to do things? Now, I'm not here arguing that there are. I don't know. I'm not a Middle East expert, but I do believe that we ought to have that discussion and that inquiry. I'd like to, if I could, just read to you a quote from Harry Truman when he, in March of 1947, when he articulated the Truman Doctrine. And this is what he said: "The seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and want. They spread and grow in the evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. We must keep that hope alive." These words, I think, still ring very true today. And Truman was I think, very correct, and fortunately neither he nor any president after him really embraced those words.
Right,
and
right.
We got into Vietnam thinking that we could bomb them into submission. We could win their hearts and minds through dropping bombs from B-52s at 30,000 feet. And all I'm saying is that we ought to be more sophisticated about the way we try to influence the world. Vietnam was clearly, I think, a political conflict that was fought with bombs and guns, and it did nothing to address. In fact, it made worse all the problems that we were trying to change. The problem there was not communism. The problem there was a nationalistic fervor. People wanted their country back. They've been fighting, those Vietnamese people had been fighting for 1,000 years. The Chinese and the French and then the Americans, all they wanted was their damn country back. And we were just one in a long line of foreign invaders who wouldn't let them have it, who wanted to impose our notion of democracy upon them. And we had no clue about their culture, their people. We didn't even try. And I think that we may be getting into the same, we may be approaching the same kind of hubris when it comes to the Middle East. We think that, well, if you'll just adopt an American-style democracy, everything will be hunky-dory. And I think that's very simplistic, but I think a lot of people are falling for that.
My personal view, as I've gotten older, and I'm over 60 now. Another week I'll be about 63. And as I've hit my 50s and my 60s, I've come to think that culture is everything in this world. And it seems to me, Bob, that in Vietnam and today too, we don't understand you cannot impose your own culture, whether it be political or economic. They tried in Russia in 1991 or two. We sent all these hotshots from Harvard over there and they helped gum things up royally. We cannot impose our culture on people 5 and 8 and 10,000 miles away. Why does America think it can? I guess maybe that's what Truman, Fulbright called the arrogance of power. I mean, fundamentally, Bob, haven't we acted dishonestly often? I mean, we were sort of dishonest about why we were, in part, as to why we were getting into Vietnam. We were dishonest as to why we were fighting for Kuwait. And weren't we dishonest in saying we were going into Afghanistan in part to give them a decent government back, not just to get rid of the Taliban? This stuff has no reality to it, does it?
No, it doesn't. I mean, you know, almost every war that we fought, the leader of the foreign country has been compared to Hitler.
Yeah,
We're over there wherever we are, fighting to restore or maintain democracy. And you take example South Vietnam. That was no more a democracy than Kuwait was a democracy. Right. I mean, it was an authoritarian regime.
And in both cases, we were fighting for democracy, allegedly.
Allegedly fighting to maintain or restore democracy, when in fact there was nothing of the sort. Yeah. But you know, the American people fall for that all the time. You know, and I think it goes back to the inability or unwillingness of members of Congress to really apply themselves in an intellectually honest way to these decisions. And it also is a reflection of the American people and their unwillingness to become engaged in the world, to inform themselves about what is going on outside of the borders of their hometown. Sometimes their focus is that narrow. And I think that you know, it's the chicken or the egg. Are members of Congress uninterested in foreign affairs and uninterested in the world because their constituents are uninterested, or is it the other way around? I don't know, but the fact remains that by and large the American people and their elected representatives generally could care less about the rest of the world.
Do you think that there's any kind of public knowledge out there about questions such as the following? What is the threat exactly that Saddam Hussein is to the United States or to our allies? Is it that he's going to attack Israel? Is it that he's going to attack Iran? Is it that he's going to send in suitcases full of bacteria. What are people will he die? He's 65 years old now. Is he going? How much longer is he going to live? Is he going to live as long as Castro did, or is he not going to live that? Are people even asking these kinds of questions?
Here's another question. Or if we depose him, who takes
like his son, for example?
Right, like his son. Yeah. You're exactly right. And those were the questions that I think were not really asked during Vietnam either. You know, what are we really over there? What are the risks? Is this war? Is this conflict really about the national security of the United States, or is it about imposing our view of the world and our view of democracy or culture on another country? I tend to think that perhaps that going to war in Iraq to replace Saddam Hussein might not be such a bad idea. My only problem is that I'm afraid that only one man is going to make that decision, when I think 535 men and women have the responsibility to this generation and future generations of Americans to make that decision and not let that one man do it. We fought a revolution in this country because we didn't want a king. Yep. And when it comes to war in this country, we still have a king.
This is exactly right, and not generally recognized. And when the one man makes the decision, whether it was Johnson in Vietnam, or the first Bush in Kuwait, or the second Bush now with regard to Iraq, realistically speaking, what happens is that there's a small group around him who have an inordinate influence. That happened in Vietnam. It looks to be happening again, and it happened back in 1991, didn't it?
Yes, it did. And you look at, I'll go back to Vietnam and the influence, Mike Mansfield, majority leader of the Senate, the foremost expert in Congress about Asia, had traveled there, knew the leaders. He knew a lot more about Asia and Vietnam than did Lyndon Johnson and the people around him. Mansfield spent more time over there and familiarized himself, was an Asian scholar, a professor of Asian history.
And afterwards became the ambassador to Japan.
Afterwards became the ambassador to Japan, served there under several administrations.
Yeah.
And if you go back and you put aside Mansfield's unwillingness to speak out in public when it really counted, but if you look at what Mansfield wrote, how Mansfield advised Lyndon Johnson privately, and then you match it up to the private advice that he was getting from his advisors. You know, the people who knew a lot less about the country, a lot less about the culture, a lot less about the risks involved in going to war in Vietnam, had such a louder voice and much greater influence because not only their proximity and because they were in Johnson's inner circle. Mansfield, as close as he was to Johnson, was not in the inner circle. He was in Congress. And it's, to me, an amazing thing that Johnson, a creature of Congress, the minute that he got into the White House, so completely disregarded their advice, so completely disregarded their role in the decisions that he was making, and they were an annoyance. These members of Congress who were coming down to the White House giving Johnson this contrarian advice were an annoyance. He didn't really listen to them.
Yeah. The people that you're speaking of, right, were fundamentally Walt Rostow, McGeorge and William Bundy, Robert McNamara,
Dean Rusk,
and Dean Rusk. These were probably the five, and then there were some subsecretaries like Michael Forrestal and Roger Hilsman. Right. But these guys were the big five, and they were the best and the brightest. And Johnson apparently felt that, my God, Kennedy brought all these great brains into the administration. I've got to listen to them. Who are their equivalents today? And were they also the equivalents back in 1991? The people who were around the president, who are having a tremendous input on the decisions, as far as we know. Nobody really knows anything.
Well, what we know, I think, is that the contrarian voices around the president are not really being given much of a hearing. Colin Powell and apparently the Joint Chiefs of Staff have serious concerns about the wisdom of going into...
That's remarkable.
Yes, it is. It really is. It really is.
When you compare it to Vietnam, where these guys were a bunch of empty suits,
right.
And Kennedy had thought of them as empty suits in today's language back around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I'm sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead.
And so you've got the military brass and the Secretary of State, a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who apparently are at least, if not opposed, are very cautious about how we go about this. And they are being opposed by the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, and all the people in those two are the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, and these people. And I think it's a charade for Bush or anyone around him to say that these decisions have not been made. It's clear that they have made a decision that they want to go to war in Iraq. They just haven't figured out how they're going to justify it. And it's clear that Powell and the brass are being shunted aside, and whatever will pass for a debate in this country about war is occurring within the confines of the White House and not in the halls of Congress. And again, I go back to what a potential disaster that could be for this country if the country and its elected representatives are not along for the ride on this.
So essentially, it's Cheney who was involved in the first Iraq War.
Right.
It's Wolfowitz who...
Wolfowitz.
Was he involved in the first one? I don't remember.
I don't believe he was.
I don't think he was either. Condoleezza Rice, who was not, and Rumsfeld, who was, if I remember correctly.
I believe Rumsfeld was in private.
Is he in private then? So he goes back to the Nixon years, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. In any event, it's that small group. Now, what accounts for the chiefs? Back in the Vietnam War, the chiefs, taking no heed of what happened to MacArthur, said, I'm going up to the 38th, or whatever the parallel was, and the Chinese won't come in. And next thing you know, we were getting flooded with Chinese infantry coming across, in Korea. The chiefs paid no attention to that. They didn't seem to care about whether or not China came in the war or Russia came in the war. Johnson was, and maybe McNamara, but Johnson particularly, were the people who were really worried about that. And the chiefs were just, we'll bomb them into the Stone Age. What accounts for the fact that today the chiefs seem to be so much more prudent than their counterparts were in those days? Maybe smart.
Yeah,
maybe they're just plain smarter.
I don't know. Maybe they are smarter. Maybe they are more sophisticated. Maybe, and I hope this is the case. I don't know. I really can't answer that question except to think that perhaps the military has learned some lessons from Vietnam. The Powell Doctrine, which very simplistically says that we should not get into a war unless we have clearly articulated goals and a clearly defined way of achieving those goals and a clearly defined exit strategy, that perhaps the military brass has embraced that in some way. And what concerns me and others is that perhaps they see something that the rest of us haven't seen, and I think that that's all the more reason for having that debate, having hearings, having that debate in Congress, lay it all out on the table. I'm not talking about opening up the files of the CIA and exposing national security secrets, but I think that we can have this debate in a reasonable, responsible way that doesn't endanger our forces once and if they do go to war. But we can have that debate, and we're just not having it.
Something you said, the CIA. You make a point which is really shocking in your book. And I'd like to ask you why you say it and where you found the information. You say that Richard Nixon in the 1968 campaign, when he claimed he had a plan to end the war, which he of course didn't have, that was preposterous. Mm-hmm. You say that he was guilty of virtual treason. Why do you say that?
Well, Nixon was so worried that he was going to lose to Humphrey, and that he was willing to do just about anything, including undermining the peace talks that were about to come to fruition.
They were this close.
They were very close. They were this close. And Nixon was afraid that it was primarily a political ploy that Johnson was engineering to get Humphrey elected. Mm-hmm. The two men were neck and neck. It was late in the campaign in October, and Nixon, through intermediaries, sent messages to the South Vietnamese government, all the while publicly saying, I support the president, I support the peace process, I will do or say nothing to undermine the peace process, I'm an honorable man, blah, blah, blah. And all the while, behind the scenes, Nixon was sending messages to the South Vietnamese government to reject the peace agreement, to refuse to participate in it, to refuse to endorse it, because if you will do that, not only will the process fall apart, Humphrey will be disadvantaged because of that, but you'll get a much better deal out of me. I won't let up. Mm-hmm. I'll bomb them harder. I'll take the battle to them, and that's what the South Vietnamese government wanted to hear. So Nixon, I think a very compelling case can be made, and the evidence is readily available that Nixon did this, and Anna Chennault, who was his intermediary, and others have discussed this publicly in the ensuing years. And I think you can make the case that
How come the public doesn't? I mean, I didn't know this, and I read a lot. How come the public generally doesn't know about this? Because this is a most serious charge, and one for which, You claim extensive evidence already on the record.
And I don't know, and I can't explain that, because I think that if you stack it up against Watergate and all the other crimes in the Nixon administration, to my knowledge, maybe forgetting somebody, but I don't think anybody died in the Watergate scandal.
Yeah, right.
But because of what Nixon did, you could argue that the war was extended for at least another 4 or more years.
Yeah.
And during the Nixon administration, more than 20,000 American lives were lost in the war, and untold hundreds, thousands, possibly millions of lives on the other side were lost, just so a man could get elected to the White House.
Yeah.
I think that is a tragedy and a crime of epic proportions.
Yeah. Barry Goldwater has said some of the most, my point is, Barry Goldwater has said some of the most unkind things about Richard Nixon and the way he conducted himself as President of the United States. There's no Democrat who's been as hard on Nixon as Barry Goldwater was. I want to ask you, we'll come back from a brief public service announcement in just a minute. I want to ask you about Barry Goldwater's 1964 campaign, because I think that has a large resonance, a large relevance for what's happening today. Stay with us. We'll be right back after a brief public service announcement. Bob, people as ancient as I, whether you spell it with a T or a C, remember the 1964 election. We remember the Democrats, what today would be called an attack ad, where they had a girl picking Daisy, little girl picking Daisy with a mushroom cloud in the background, and the vote for Goldwater, this is what you're going to get. And Goldwater adopted what he thought, and I think what most people probably think was a patriotic stance. He wasn't going to discuss the war. He wasn't going to make an issue of it. You know, politics stops at the water's edge. That was the big slogan for 20, 30 years in this country. And yet it's possible to say, isn't it, that in doing that for patriotic reasons, he committed an enormous disservice for the country, didn't he?
Yes, he did, and I don't think he did it for patriotic reasons. He did it for political reasons. Goldwater and Johnson had serious problems regarding Vietnam for different reasons. The joke around Washington about Goldwater was that Lincoln was the great emancipator, Goldwater was the great defoliator. And Goldwater was struggling with an image that he wanted to go in there and just level the whole, turn Vietnam into a large parking lot with nuclear bombs. And he had that Dr. Strangelove quality about him. And so it was not to his advantage to really talk about military affairs, because people were scared of what he might do. So his interest was to take that issue off the table. He also cut a similar deal with Johnson about civil rights. We won't attack each other on civil rights or Vietnam, because they both had problems with that for different reasons. Johnson's problem in Vietnam was just the opposite. He wanted to assure people that everything was cool over there, that there was no problem, that everything was well under control, and so it was to his advantage to stress not our foreign problems, but his vision of what we should do with a great society, Medicare, other social programs that Johnson was in love with and really wanted to pass through Congress, and did not want anything in Vietnam to make it harder for him to enact more of his great society programs. So they both did a great disservice, and I think you can say Goldwater did do a great disservice by volunteering to take that off the table, but Johnson did a greater disservice by actually duping the American people. He went around the country saying, we will have no wider war, I won't send American boys 10,000 miles around the globe to do fighting that Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. And you know, there are people who have said that Johnson couched that in terms of, and qualified that and said that, you know, we may have to fight and all that. And yes, he did.
At this time. It's very lawyerish. At this time, I've made no decision.
There were all these little qualifiers in there, but Johnson and his people knew that the message, that the newspapers would not report the qualifiers. They would report, the headline would be, no wider war.
Right.
No, Asian boys not sent across, American boys not sent 10,000 miles across the ocean. And what amazes me about all this is that Johnson won a landslide, a huge landslide, the largest landslide in American history at the time. He won a landslide election, and he did it around no wider war, no deeper war in Vietnam. He had a mandate to get this country out of the war. And one of the great mysteries and one of the great tragedies of the Johnson administration is that he didn't use that mandate to do what he could have done to get us out of
and while he was saying
morass.
this, his administration was laying plans for more men, more. If Goldwater had only come out and said regularly what he thinks, there could have been a debate as to the legitimacy and the morality and the need for doing what he was suggesting, which is pretty much what we did, except for the fact that we probably didn't bomb quite as much as he would have until Nixon and the Christmas bombing, and we didn't send 1 million men in, and we didn't invade North Vietnam. Other than that, we pretty much did what Goldwater
Absolutely.
wanted to do.
I mean, you look at what the reports that McNamara got in late 1967 from, and he presented this evidence to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and created quite a stir and really was the beginning of the end for McNamara. McNamara disclosed to the Senate Armed Services Committee that during the years of bombing in Vietnam, that we had hit and destroyed 85% of all the targets that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had requested of us. And the only thing remaining were some targets around Hanoi and the Chinese border. And yet, through all that bombing, through that massive bombing that exceeded anything that we did in World War II, the Vietnamese strength was, the North Vietnamese strength was still, they were still a potent fighting force.
I mean, the places where the factories were in Moscow.
Right.
You'd have to bomb Russia if you wanted to stop. And if you mined Haiphong Harbor, they bring them across China by railroad until China and Russia had that big split along about the beginning of the 70s.
Yep.
I mean, so nobody ever discussed any of that kind of stuff. And Goldwater, had he stuck to his guns in '64, we might have discussed that. And you know what, I've often thought, and I think this goes to the essence of what's going on today, that had Lyndon Johnson ever come to Congress and said, I want a resolution, I want you guys to pass a resolution knowing I intend to put 650,000 men in Vietnam, and I want a resolution that says, put 650,000 men in Vietnam. Never, never. And don't we face some of the same kind of thing today with Iraq? We don't know how big this war is going to be.
No, we don't. And I don't know. I'm not sure the motivations are the same, but I know that Johnson got us into Vietnam incrementally, slowly, gradually, almost imperceptibly in some ways, because he didn't want people to realize that we were getting into a war of that size, because he knew that conservatives in Congress, because of budgetary concerns, they had to choose between the Great Society and the war. They were going to choose the war, and the Great Society was going to suffer. That was one of Johnson's main motivations for keeping the war a secret to the extent that he did, and telling so many lies about it. And you know, I don't know what the political corollary is today. You know, politics, you can't separate politics from war. There is a political component to all of this that we're talking about whether we go into Iraq or not. And I don't think you can't separate the two. My guess is that the comparisons are not that useful right now, because I think that probably the Bush people and a lot of other people see, at least in the short term, a great political benefit from going to war in Iraq. And I'm not saying that's their only calculation. I don't mean to imply that. I think that there are reasonable, prudent, intelligent people who think that we ought to go to war in Iraq to change that regime. And I'm not here to argue with them necessarily, but I hope that we're not guided entirely by politics. And I'm not saying we are, but I think a lot of what happened in Vietnam was guided by domestic politics and not by prudent foreign and military affairs.
Right, and you make a huge point in your book, throughout the book. No president wanted to be the next president to lose another Asian country, as we quote, lost China.
That's right.
And Truman got skewered for the fact that we, quote, lost China, that he, quote, lost China.
Yeah.
Nobody else wanted to be in that position. Conceivably, down the line, Bush and whoever succeeds Bush doesn't want to be the person to say, gee, I could have done something about Iraq. As the Israelis did in 1981 when they bombed the Osiris, or whatever the name of that nuclear reactor was, and took it out. Or as his father could have done back in 1991. They're not going to want to be, gee, I could have taken out Saddam Hussein back before he unleashed whatever it is that maybe he'll unleash in the world.
And this is all the more reason why we should have a debate.
Yeah.
Because we should lay out the reasons. You know, if we're going to go to war in Iraq, we need to have a debate. The American people need to understand why we're doing it. And I think a lot of people need to have the comfort that we're not doing it, number one, for purely political reasons, and we're not doing it because this president wants to settle a score that's left over from his father's administration, that there really is a very legitimate strong national security case that can be made for us to do this. And I think if they make that case, good for them and good for this country, because when and if we do go to war, that war will be, I think, more sustainable by public opinion and by congressional support than it would be if the decision's made by one man. It will become George Bush's war, and it ought to be politically a war of the Congress, because the support will be more sustainable that way.
I don't think there's any doubt, do you, Bob, that his father benefited dramatically in that very respect from the very fact that Congress, even though by a badly split vote, nonetheless approved going to war against Iraq back in 1991.
That's right. Clearly he did, yes.
Yeah. Why is it, do you think, or has anybody in Congress stood up and just bluntly said, the President of the United States does not currently have the power to enter a war against Iraq. It would be illegal for him to do so, not just bad politics, terrible politics perhaps, but it would be illegal for him to do so. He needs our approval in Congress by at least 51% in each house. Why has nobody stood up and said that?
I don't know, and I think perhaps it's the same reason that Congress has always, at least in the last half century, abdicated its responsibilities, because number one, people have always said, and this is a point that I should have made earlier, that one of the common refrains is that the President has all the information. The President has the intelligence information. The average member of Congress, unless you're serving on the Intelligence Committee, you're not privy to what the President's seeing. So people are willing to give, members of Congress are by and large willing to give the President and his advisors the benefit of the doubt, because he has information they do not have. But
they could get it.
They could get it. And,
yeah.
But the problem with all this is, and how Congress undermines its own authority in this area, is that sometimes when they do get it, the FBI is currently about to conduct polygraph tests and do a very intensive investigation of the Senate Intelligence Committee because of information that was given to them, which was apparently leaked to the press. And when those kinds of things happen, it really, really, really undermines the authority of Congress in this area, and they shoot themselves in the foot and make it harder for them to get information from the administration that they need to make the decisions that they may be called upon to make.
That has led in Vietnam, did it not, to the most dire regret by people. Fulbright, McGovern once stood up in Congress and Senate and said, there is blood, this chamber reeks of blood. The failure to get the information and the failure to get it and then act on it was something that some of these people have been carrying on their conscience to their graves, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I think, if I may, I'd like to just read a couple of lines from that reeks of blood.
Well, we have to wrap it up, so you have to read fast.
And this is just a couple lines. Every senator in this chamber is partly responsible for sending 50,000 young Americans to an early grave. This chamber reeks of blood. Every senator is partly responsible for that human wreckage at Walter Reed and Bethesda Naval Hospitals. And he didn't say that because every member of Congress voted for a declaration of war to send them there. He said that because every member of Congress, except for two, had abdicated their responsibilities and didn't stop what they could have stopped when they could have stopped it.
Bob, I want to thank you for coming up from Baton Rouge. As I said earlier, this is the first time that a program has ever been as current as this morning's headlines. That's a terrible, terrible shame that it had to be that way. But so be it. Thank you for coming up and for sharing with us some of the wisdom that you put down extensively in a most current and most excellent book.
Thank you.
To the audience, thank you for being with us. I hope that this was informative. It's terrible, but this is of the essence this very day, this very morning that we have taped this program. Thank you for being with us.